At 3:17 in the morning, a 54-year-old man is awake in the dark. He hasn't moved. His breathing is controlled enough that the woman beside him doesn't stir. But his mind is running a calculation that has no answer, a looping inventory of everything he has done, everything he has not done, everything that is slipping, and whether the distance between where he is and where he thought he would be is a gap that can still be closed, or whether it is simply the shape his life has taken. He will be awake for 2 hours. He will tell no one. This is not insomnia. The clinical category misses something. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, studying age-related sleep architecture found that men in their early to mid-50s experience a measurable increase in what sleep scientists call sleep maintenance insomnia. The ability to fall asleep intact, the ability to stay asleep absent. But what the polysomnography data cannot capture is the content of the wakefulness. The American Psychological Association's 2023 Stress in America survey found that men aged 45 to 64 report higher rates of what the survey terms ruminative nighttime cognition than any other demographic group, including people with diagnosed anxiety disorders. They are not worrying in the clinical sense. They are auditing. The audit is specific. It does not concern itself with abstract fears. It concerns the mortgage that has 17 years left on it. The son who stopped returning calls in a way that feels different from before, though nothing was said. The career that plateaued somewhere around 51 and whether that plateau is a landing or a cliff. The body that takes longer to recover from everything, the late dinner, the extra drink, the one set too many in the gym, and what that trajectory implies about the next decade. The retirement account that the market last quarter treated with indifference. The friendship that dissolved without ceremony. The father who is 81 and declining in a way that is no longer deniable. The sense specific and persistent that time has a new texture, that it is moving in a direction now, not just passing. If you found this video, you already know what this is. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The phenomenon has a name in developmental psychology, though it is rarely used outside academic literature. Erik Erikson, the developmental theorist whose 8-stage model of human development remains foundational in the field, identified the crisis of middle adulthood as the tension between what he called generativity and stagnation. The man awake at 3 a.m. is not having a crisis in the colloquial sense. He is having the crisis Erikson predicted in 1950, the confrontation with the question of whether one's life is producing something that will outlast it. Erikson's framework was specific. Men who cannot answer that question affirmatively begin to turn inward in ways that become psychologically corrosive. The 3 a.m. audit is the corrosion in progress. But Erikson did not know what cortisol does at 3 a.m. The biological mechanism is more precise than the psychological framework suggests. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, follows a circadian rhythm in which its nadir, its lowest point, occurs around midnight, and its rise begins around 3 to 4 a.m. as the body prepares for waking. In men over 50, this cortisol rise is both earlier and steeper than in younger men, according to research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. The brain, flooded with cortisol in the early morning hours and simultaneously deprived of the deep slow-wave sleep that produces emotional regulation, is at its least defended. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for contextualizing, decatastrophizing, and assigning accurate proportions to threats, is underperforming. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, is running hot. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological condition that makes 3 a.m. feel like everything is slightly more serious than it actually is. The man doing the audit is doing it with compromised equipment. The audit is real. The proportions are distorted. Both things are true simultaneously. This is what nobody says about the 3 a.m. loop. It is not irrational. The fears it surfaces are genuine. The mortgage is real. The son's silence is real. The career plateau is real. The body's new recovery curve is real. What is distorted is not the content of the concerns but the weight assigned to each one, and the sense, particular to 3 a.m., that they are all due simultaneously, that they form a unified emergency rather than a collection of ordinary ongoing problems. The sleep-deprived, cortisol-elevated brain cannot distinguish between a problem that needs attention tomorrow and a problem that is catastrophic right now. At 3 a.m. they feel identical. Dr. Matthew Walker, director of the Center for Human Sleep Science at UC Berkeley, has documented this specific mechanism. In his 2017 work, Why We Sleep, Walker describes how REM sleep, which is concentrated in the second half of the night, serves as what he calls overnight therapy, a neurochemical process by which the emotional charge of difficult memories is stripped away while the informational content is retained. Men in their 50s experience significant REM disruption from multiple causes simultaneously: reduced testosterone production, increased sleep apnea prevalence, heightened cortisol reactivity, and alcohol consumption that suppresses REM architecture even in moderate amounts. The man who has a drink to decompress is, neurologically, removing the very sleep stage that would have made the 3 a.m. audit less devastating. He is dismantling the mechanism that would have protected him from himself. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The coping strategy most commonly deployed by men in this demographic, the evening drink, the nightcap, the beer that signals the day is over, is measurably worsening the very condition it is meant to address. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has tracked what researchers there call gray area drinking, in men aged 50 to 65, consumption that falls below clinical thresholds for alcohol use disorder, but above what the NIaaa defines as low-risk drinking. The prevalence in this demographic increased 35% between 2002 and 2020. The same cohort reports the highest rates of sleep dissatisfaction of any adult male demographic. The correlation is not subtle. If this is landing, share this video. Someone you know needs to see it. The thought loop itself follows a recognizable architecture, though no one has formally mapped it because the men experiencing it do not typically describe it to clinicians in enough detail for patterns to emerge. Sociologist Michael Kimmel, whose research on American masculinity has been conducted over 4 decades at Stony Brook University, has written about what he terms the masculinity straitjacket, the internalized prohibition on discussing internal states that leaves men without language for experiences that are, in fact, widely shared. The 3 a.m. thought loop is nearly universal in men in this demographic. The sense of isolation it produces, the specific loneliness of lying awake beside a sleeping partner with thoughts that feel unspeakable, is a direct product of a cultural formation, not a personal failure. But the cultural formation is invisible to the man experiencing it, because the cultural formation is the water he has always swum in. The thoughts follow a sequence. Not always, not perfectly, but with enough consistency that the sequence can be described. It begins with a trigger, almost always mundane. A bill noticed at dinner. A number on a scale. A sentence in an email from a manager. A memory surface without invitation. The trigger is not the subject of the loop. It is the door. Once open, the loop expands outward from the trigger in a pattern that psychologists call cognitive spreading activation, one node of concern lighting up adjacent nodes, each of which lights up its own adjacent nodes, until the man is simultaneously processing the mortgage, the son, the career, the body, the father, and the question underneath all of them, which is the question he does not name because naming it would make it too heavy to carry. The unnamed question is about legacy, about whether his life at this point in its arc is what he intended it to be, or what he can be proud of, or what will remain when he is gone, and whether those 3 things are the same thing because he is beginning to suspect they are not. Research psychologist Dan McAdams at Northwestern University has spent 30 years studying what he calls narrative identity, the story individuals construct about their own lives to make those lives coherent and meaningful. His research on men in midlife consistently finds a specific narrative disruption. The story that made sense at 35, in which the protagonist was ascending, accumulating, and building toward a peak, no longer fits the available facts at 54. The man must revise the story, but no one has told him that story revision is the work, and no one has given him the tools for it. So instead he wakes at 3 a.m. and runs the old story against the current facts and finds the gap intolerable. The gap is not failure. It is the ordinary distance between aspiration and outcome that every human life contains. But without a revised narrative framework, it reads as failure. Subscribe if you want more content that doesn't flinch. There is a class dimension to the thought loop that almost nobody discusses. The content of the audit varies significantly by economic circumstance, but the structure is consistent across income brackets, suggesting that the phenomenon is not primarily about financial precarity, though financial precarity intensifies it. A 54-year-old man with a $900,000 retirement account and a paid-off mortgage is awake at 3 a.m. running a different audit than a 54-year-old man with $40,000 in savings and 3 years left on his mortgage. but both are awake. The research on this is less direct than it should be, because large-scale sleep studies rarely cross-tabulate sleep disruption with income in ways that would make the class dynamics visible. What the Gallup Healthways Wellbeing Index data from 2014 through 2020 shows is that self-reported sleep quality among men aged 50 to 64 correlates with income in a U-shaped curve. Men at both the bottom and the top of the income distribution report better sleep than men in the middle. The men in the middle, with enough to lose, not enough to feel secure, are the ones most reliably awake. The middle is a specific kind of exposure. The body enters the loop in ways that are not merely metaphorical. Men over 50 experience a 1 to 2% annual decline in testosterone production, a process called andropause, which lacks the cultural visibility of menopause but produces documented effects on mood, energy, and cognitive function that are relevant to the 3 a.m. architecture. The American Neurological Association estimated in 2021 that approximately 40% of men over 45 have clinically low testosterone, though fewer than 10% are being treated. The symptoms of low testosterone, poor sleep quality, increased anxiety, reduced stress tolerance, irritability, and a diffuse sense that one's emotional responses are somehow out of proportion, are identical to the symptom profile of the man doing the 3 a.m. audit. The two conditions are not merely correlated. In many cases, one is producing the other. The man experiencing what feels like an existential reckoning may be, in part, experiencing a hormonal shift that has received none of the cultural scaffolding that would make it legible to him. He does not have a word for what is happening to his body. He has the experience and he has silence. The silence is load-bearing. It is not accidental. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Men's Health, conducted by researchers at the University of Michigan's Depression Center, found that men in the 50 to 64 age bracket were significantly less likely than women of comparable age to discuss emotional distress with a partner, physician, or friend, and were simultaneously significantly more likely to describe their distress as physical symptoms: the headache, the tightness in the chest, the fatigue that does not resolve with rest. The body is speaking a language the man can acknowledge without having to acknowledge what it is actually saying. This is not evasion in the simple sense. It is the product of a socialization so thorough that the translation layer between emotional experience and emotional language has become genuinely inaccessible. Men in this demographic are twice as likely to die by suicide as men in any other adult age group. The statistics should not arrive without context, so here is the context. This is not because men in their 50s are uniquely fragile. It is because the conditions described above, isolation, narrative disruption, biological vulnerability, inadequate help-seeking, the specific weight of the 3 a.m. audit, accumulate over years without outlet, in a demographic that has been systematically told that the accumulation is not happening. The Centers for Disease Control's 2022 data on suicide mortality by age and gender shows the 45 to 64 male demographic as the highest risk group in the country. The group nobody is talking about is the group most at risk. That sentence deserves to be read again. The counterargument arrives here, and it is worth engaging seriously. Some researchers in positive psychology, including Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, whose PERMA model of well-being has been applied to midlife studies, argue that men in their 50s, when studied longitudinally rather than cross-sectionally, show higher life satisfaction than men in their 30s and 40s on several dimensions. The U-curve of happiness, documented most prominently by economist David Blanchflower at Dartmouth College using data from 132 countries, shows that life satisfaction bottoms out somewhere between the late 40s and mid-50s and then rises again. By this account, the 3 a.m. thought loop is a nadir, not a permanent state. The man awake at 3 a.m. is near the bottom of the U, but the curve bends upward. The counterargument is real, and the data supporting it is substantial. But the U-curve describes population averages. At 3:17 in the morning, a population average offers nothing. What the longitudinal research also shows, and this is the piece that gets dropped from the optimistic summary, is that the men who emerge from this period with higher life satisfaction are disproportionately the ones who made changes during it. Not passive recipients of a curve that bends on its own, but men who revise their social structures, their relationship to work, their physical routines, their proximity to other men, and their willingness to name what was happening. The curve does not bend for men who wait for it to bend. It bends for men who become, in some specific and usually uncomfortable way, different. If this video is giving you language for something you haven't been able to name, share it. The social isolation component cannot be overstated, and it is consistently understated. A 2021 survey by the Survey Center on American Life at the American Enterprise Institute found that 15% of American men reported having no close friends. Among men over 50, the figure was higher, with the sharpest increases occurring precisely in the age bracket under examination. The same survey found that men over 50 were significantly more likely than younger men or women of any age to describe their social connections as inadequate, and significantly less likely to be doing anything about it. The friendship deficit is not new. It accretes over decades of prioritizing work and family over male friendship, and by 54 the infrastructure for close male connection has often been effectively dismantled. The man awake at 3 a.m. is running the audit alone partly because there is no one to run it with. The isolation is not chosen. It is the residue of years of choices that each seemed reasonable at the time. There is a specific grief in this that has no name in the culture and therefore no container. Men in their 50s are statistically likely to be experiencing loss from multiple simultaneous directions. Parents entering decline or dying. Marriages under the particular pressure of children leaving home, and the decades-long deferred reckoning with who two people have become to each other. Careers that have either plateaued or begun the active process of diminishing. Friendships that have not survived geography and time. Physical capacities that are, for the first time, genuinely and permanently reduced rather than temporarily diminished. Each of these losses in isolation might be grievable. Stacked simultaneously, with no cultural ritual or language for what this period is, they become the material of the audit. The man at 3 a.m. is not weak. He is holding more than anyone has told him he would be holding. The retirement question arrives at 3 a.m. with particular force for a demographic reason that is structural and largely invisible. Men in their 50s today are the first cohort to have spent their entire working lives in the era of defined contribution retirement accounts, 401(k)s that shifted the risk of retirement security from employers to employees. Their fathers had pensions. They have portfolios, which means they have exposure, which means they have the knowledge every market quarter of exactly how much ground they have lost or gained. The Employee Benefit Research Institute's 2023 Retirement Confidence Survey found that among workers aged 55 to 64, 43% reported feeling not too confident, or not at all confident, about having enough money to live comfortably throughout retirement. This is not irrational anxiety. The median retirement savings for Americans approaching retirement is, depending on the data source, somewhere between $88,000 and $186,000, figures that represent approximately 2 to 5 years of median living expenses. The 3 a.m. math is not paranoid. It is arithmetic. The thought loop always arrives at the father. This is perhaps the most universally reported element when men in this demographic do describe the loop in clinical or research settings. The father who is aging, who is diminished, who is perhaps dying, who is becoming the version of himself that requires care, carries a specific weight because he is also a mirror. The man watching his father at 81 is watching himself at 81, and the 27 years in between are, at 3 a.m., not reassuring. They are the interval he is being asked to account for. Developmental psychologist Ruth Ellen Josselson, whose work on narrative identity and midlife transition draws on 4 decades of longitudinal interview data, has documented what she calls the father mirror, the way in which men in their 50s use their aging fathers as a lens through which to evaluate their own trajectory. The evaluation is rarely neutral, and beneath the father is the man's own mortality, which he has been successfully not thinking about for decades and which has become, in his 50s, significantly harder to not think about. Not in an abstract sense. In the specific sense of, what does a 54-year-old man with a family history of cardiac events and a resting heart rate of 72 and a stress level that has been elevated for years actually have to look forward to in terms of time? The question is not morbid. It is the most practical question he has ever faced, and no one has given him a framework for it. Share this if you know someone who is carrying this without knowing other people are carrying it too. The specific loneliness of the 3 a.m. loop, lying still in the dark beside a sleeping partner with thoughts that feel too heavy to speak, has a function that researchers in couples psychology have identified, but rarely discuss in public terms. Dr. Sue Johnson, founder of Emotionally Focused Therapy and a researcher at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, has documented what she calls the protector pattern in men, the way in which men who feel emotionally overwhelmed default to withdrawal and silence, not as indifference to their partners, but as an attempt to protect the relationship from the weight of their own internal state. The man at 3 a.m. is not emotionally unavailable in the simple sense. He is emotionally over capacity, and the only management strategy available to him is containment. The containment keeps the relationship functional. It also makes the loop worse because the relief that human connection would provide is not accessed, and the loop continues. The partner who sleeps beside him does not know what she is sleeping beside, and he is not certain she would want to. Psychologist Terence Real, who has written extensively on male depression and the suppression of emotional states in men, makes a clinical observation that applies directly to this moment. Men in the 50s are often in what he terms covert depression, a state in which the clinical markers of depression are present but expressed through behaviors rather than emotional reporting. Irritability, workaholism, substance use, risk-taking, social withdrawal, the restlessness that produces the 3 a.m. loop. The condition meets diagnostic criteria. The man does not present to a physician describing sadness. He presents, if he presents at all, describing fatigue or the sleep problem or the chest tightness that isn't quite chest pain. Or he does not present at all, because presenting requires the admission that something is wrong, and the admission that something is wrong is the thing the entire formation of his masculinity has been built to prevent. He is, in Terence Real's precise formulation, depressed but not sad, suffering but not suffering in a way he can name or seek help for. The help-seeking gap is structural and has documented consequences. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's 2022 data shows that men are 3.63 times more likely than women to die by suicide, and that this ratio has been widening, not narrowing. Within that statistic, the middle-aged male demographic carries disproportionate weight. The research on why is not mysterious. Men in their 50s are the demographic least likely to be in therapy, least likely to be on antidepressants, least likely to have discussed their mental state with a physician, and most likely to describe themselves as fine in clinical intake surveys before presenting with the kind of crisis that indicates they were not fine for some time. The gap between what is happening and what is reported is not a gap of dishonesty. It is a gap of language, a gap of permission, a gap built over 5 decades of being told, in ways too pervasive to catalog, that internal states are not the province of men. At some point in the loop, usually between 4 and 5 a.m., when the cortisol curve is near its daily peak and the sky is beginning to change in a way that is somehow both relieving and depressing, something shifts. Not a resolution. A kind of exhaustion of the audit function. The thoughts are still present but have lost their urgency, the way a fire loses its heat before it loses its light. The man will sleep for an hour. He will wake feeling unrest. He will make coffee and move through the day. He will not mention what happened at 3 a.m. because there is no available language for it that does not feel excessive, and because the day, once it starts, requires functional presentation rather than accurate reporting. This is the 3 a.m. thought loop. It will happen again. The question underneath all of it, the one that the audit keeps circling without landing on, is not whether he has done enough or saved enough or built enough or been enough. Those are the forms the question takes. The actual question is whether the second half of his life, if he has one, will be different from the first half in some way that matters, or whether it will be a continuation of the same accumulation that has brought him to this particular darkness at this particular hour. The data suggests the second half can be different. The data also suggests that it will only be different if he makes it different, and that making it different requires naming what the first half actually was, not the version he presents but the version that runs the audit at 3 a.m. The research on men who come through this period with higher life satisfaction, stronger relationships, and better health outcomes is consistent on this point. The transition required disclosure. Not performance of vulnerability, not therapeutic confession as an end in itself, but the specific act of telling someone what is actually happening, and hearing that it is not singular, and learning that the loop has a door. Most men find the door. Some do not find it in time. What the data points toward is not a generational crisis in the catastrophic sense. It is something more specific and more actionable. It is a cohort of men who have arrived at a developmental threshold for which the culture has given them neither map nor permission to cross, carrying a biological load that makes the threshold harder to approach, in a social isolation that makes the crossing impossible to do alone, with a help-seeking inhibition that keeps them from accessing the support that would make it survivable. The pieces are individually addressable. The combination unaddressed is what produces the statistics. The man at 3 a.m. is not broken. He is at a threshold. Those are not the same thing. What remains genuinely unknown is what it would take to change this at scale. Not for any individual man who finds the language and the support, but for the demographic as a whole, for the cultural formation that produces the loop in the first place. The research on male socialization is extensive. The research on changing male socialization is sparse. The interventions that work at the individual level have not been demonstrated to work at the population level. The problem is known. The mechanism is documented. The solution is unresolved. The man will be awake again at 3 a.m. The question is whether, the next time, he knows what he is doing. Whether he knows the loop has a name. Whether he knows that the 15% cortisol elevation is distorting his proportions. Whether he knows that the man in the next room or the next house is also awake, running the same audit, and also saying nothing. Whether knowing any of that changes anything, or whether knowledge without language, without connection, without permission is just more material for the loop. That question does not have a clean answer. The data does not resolve it. The 3 a.m. darkness does not resolve it. What the darkness offers is the same thing it always offers. The specific clarity of a mind that has run out of distraction and is finally, however uncomfortable,